Good afternoon, folks. It's great to see you as always. I can't see you. I wish I could, but I feel like we've built a sort of community of caring people. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I'm very happy to welcome you to tonight's virtual Town Hall America at a Crossroads program. Thanks to our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, former Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, David Lair, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chasen, and to all of our co-sponsors. Tonight, we are very honored to welcome the dynamic ADL CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, who's been very busy of late, in conversation with the exceptional Madeleine Brand. We want to thank them both for agreeing to be with us tonight to discuss the current state of hate, including anti-Semitism in the US today and what we can do about it. Jonathan's newly released book, It Could Happen Here, and what we can do to stop it will also be the focus of our discussion. Full unedited recordings of all of our past programs can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website. In every email we send, either David or I always give you a link so you can watch any of our past programs. They remain there in perpetuity, or for as long as they'll let us keep them there. Next week, we have another extraordinary program. For many decades, campuses have been a reflection of society's most complex social issues. And today, with cancel culture and particularly dramatic racial and political divides, that complexity is particularly pronounced. Join us next week with UCLA Chancellor Jean Block, Pomona College President Gabrielle Starr, and President of the Association of American Universities, Barbara Snyder, to learn about the extraordinary challenges on today's large and small public and private college and university campuses. It should really be very interesting. The following week, that's February 16th, we are pleased to present two of the smartest pundits around to talk about politics in 2022. With the midterm elections around the corner and lots of important state, federal, and local races, we will get perspectives from the great Bill Kristol and Ron Brownstein. Be sure to look at the activism section of our website for links to lots of organizations directly engaged in fighting for voting rights and for our democracy. There are many volunteer opportunities and lots of organizations doing great work. Now, please welcome my great partner, David Lair, who's going to tell you about a couple more programs and introduce our speakers tonight. David?
Thank you, Janice. In 2 weeks, we will have a compelling program with Bart Gellman, the author of the much-discussed Atlantic Magazine article arguing why January 6, 2021 was a dress rehearsal for more violence and conspiracies. Given the revelations of the past week regarding Trump's role in seeking to overturn the presidential election, Gellman's research and conclusions seem even more troubling today than when his article came out in December. He will join us on February 23rd. On March 2nd, we'll host two of the leading lawyers who advise political parties and national leaders on what they can and can't do. Ben Ginsberg, who has served as counsel to the Republican National Committee in the 2000 Bush-Cheney campaign, will be joined by Bob Bauer, who was Barack Obama's personal attorney and also served as his White House counsel. The topic will be safeguarding free and fair elections. Pam Fester, longtime NPR national reporter covering elections and election law, will moderate. Tonight, we host the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, where I spent nearly 3 decades of my professional life. He has headed the ADL since 2015. He has modernized it. He has taken tough stands on difficult issues. He's become a recognized leader in the fight against extremism and bigotry, and he has made ADL exceptionally relevant, despite being a 109-year-old institution. He served in the Obama White House after a successful career in the business world. And as Janice mentioned, he's just written a book that has generated a good deal of buzz and will be discussed tonight. It Could Happen Here. The dialogue will be led by one of our favorite hosts, KCRW's Emmy Award-winning Madeleine Brand. Madeleine has a daily news and culture program, Press Play, on KCRW, which you can access on the web from anywhere in the world. She has been affiliated with NPR nationally and at several of its member stations for over 30 years. Madeleine, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And thank you, Janice, for inviting me back. I'm really excited to be here and excited to talk to you, Jonathan, not least because you made news this week. So let's start with that. This is the Whoopi Goldberg incident, of course, and you went on the show yesterday, I believe, to educate her on the Holocaust. And she had said it wasn't about race, but man's inhumanity to man. And she clearly didn't know her basic history, that it was all about race and the Nazis designating Jews as an inferior race. But she's not anti-Semitic. So in your mind, why was it dangerous that she said what she said?
Well, first of all, let me just say right up front, Madeleine, it's really nice to be in dialogue with you. I'm a longtime KCRW fan and used to be a member when I lived in LA. I'll also just thank everyone from Jews United for Democracy and Justice. David and Janice and Mel and Zev. I think you guys have created this really kind of novel forum, and you attract a remarkable audience and as well extraordinary guests. So like I'm looking forward to listening, having heard about the upcoming lineup or watching. So it's pretty neat for me to be a part of it and to be back here. So Whoopi Goldberg.
Yeah.
Look, let's first of all, if we talk about Whoopi, let's just like contextualize the moment, right? We're still, it's less than a week since Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day declared by the UN on the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp to remember the Shoah. This was the 77th anniversary of the liberation. We are literally within the last 10 days, we've seen a spate of anti-Semitic incidents across the country, from white supremacist flyering in multiple cities across the country, including California, blaming the Jews for COVID-19. By the way, flyers, which also showed up in Beverly Hills a few months ago, to the swastikas defacing Union Station in Washington, D.C. And we're just a couple weeks. Oh, and the Nazi rally in the rally by the National Socialist Movement in Orlando, Florida, that happened over the weekend, where they talked about, you know, Jews being the enemy. That was one of the nicer things that they said. And, you know, we're just a few weeks since the hostage crisis in Colleyville, Texas, where someone inspired by like a radical Islamist ideology took the Rabbi Charlie Citron, and 3 of his parishioners hostage in a synagogue and held them at gunpoint for almost 12 hours. He wanted to free an Al-Qaeda operative who was arrested and prosecuted and is now serving time for trying to murder U.S. soldiers and surveilling American institutions for a likely bomb attack. Which is notable here, Madeleine, because while they were impaneling the jury, the comment that she made was that these people in New York City, for an attack on New York, or for a purported attack on New York, for trying to kill American soldiers, Madeleine, her comment, the suspect was, quote, they should be DNA tested to see if any of them are Zionists, because she thought that should disqualify them from serving in her jury pool.
Wow.
And, you know, we're 6 months since Jews were brutalized, literally, on La Cienega, right near Pico Robertson, during the crisis in Gaza, as well as in Times Square, as well as in southern Florida, as well as in Las Vegas, because there was a spate of anti-Semitism across the country. And of course, we're just over a year since the rampage in the Capitol, what I would characterize as a domestic terror attack. You know, by people, some of whom were wearing shirts that said 6MWE, right? 6 million wasn't enough, or wearing Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts. So whether it's, you know, armed militia enthusiasts literally tearing apart the U.S. Capitol, to anti-Israel activists beating up Jews in broad daylight, to literal Nazis marching in Florida, to Islamist radicals taking Jews hostage. It's not, you know, an accident that Jews across the country feel alarmed in this moment. And so when Whoopi Goldberg, one of the most prominent people in daytime television, a woman whose name is literally Jewish, uses her platform to make a statement that is such a bald-faced revision of history and just flat out wrong on the facts, that's very concerning. She reaches millions and millions of impressionable people every day. And to say the Holocaust wasn't about race, I mean, the one thing the Holocaust was about was race. Now, that might not comport with, you know, a 21st century definition about how we, you know, how we conceive of the social construct of race in America. And yet, if you read, the opening page of Maus, the quote that Spiegelman put on the first page of the book is something like, I'm going to try to get it right, the Jewish people are definitely a race. They are just not a human race. That's Adolf Hitler. Right. That's literally the opening page of the book that she was ostensibly talking about. So and then further on the Colbert show, she actually called it like white on white people fighting each other. No, these weren't white on white people fighting each other, Madeleine. These were millions of Jews who were systematically dehumanized, literally hunted and murdered. They were shot to death in ditches. They were starved in the ghetto. They were incinerated in the camps. These weren't sides fighting with one another. This was the systematic annihilation of the Jewish people. And I say that we could talk more about this fiction that Jews are white, because Jews come in all sorts of hues. But the real issue here is that the racialized anti-Semitism, which culminated in the Holocaust, speaks to the complexity of these issues and trying to fit the multi-dimensional peg of thousands of years of anti-Semitism into the square hole of race in America in 2021. That was a grave mistake, and that's why we called it out.
But do you see that as, I guess, a slippery slope? So if you have her making these ill-informed, ignorant statements about the Holocaust and about Jews, do you see that as a direct line, albeit a long line, between that and Charlottesville?
Well, a few things. So I think it's fair to say that there is no relationship that I could analogize between Whoopi Goldberg, and Nazis marching, with tiki torches in Charlottesville. They're totally different. The intentions, when they say Jews will not replace us, of people like Richard Spencer and Alex Jones and whatnot, are very clear. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that is Whoopi Goldberg. On the other hand, at the ADL, we believe that you've got to call out hate when it happens. And I literally wrote this book that you see over my shoulder using our pyramid of hate as a model for thinking about these issues. Biased attitudes, if not interrupted, if not corrected, can sort of metastasize from attitudes to interactions, to systemic policies, to violence, to what we saw happen in the Shoah, or what we saw happen in Bosnia, or what we saw happen in other places around the world. So they are not the same, but we are compelled to challenge these stereotypes and to call out the facts when they are just flat out wrong. So that was why we spoke out as forcefully as we did. Now, credit to Whoopi Goldberg. She apologized on Twitter, then she apologized the next day. But the damage was done. I mean, Jews around the country, people, good, thinking people, not just Jews, were hurt and confused by what she said. So there is work to do to correct the misimpression. I think we started that yesterday on her program. There have been a series of conversations now happening all over social media and dinner tables and water coolers and Facebook feeds, and I think that's a very healthy thing. And in moments like this, Madeleine, I think that's a very healthy thing.
But she didn't say anything in your appearance on the show. She was quiet. The other hosts asked you questions and engaged you in dialogue, but she was quiet. And now she's suspended. She's off the air for 2 weeks. And so that opportunity for dialogue is not there with her. And that would be, I would presume, important to have at this moment.
So a couple things. Like I said this yesterday, and I'll say it again right here for everyone to hear. So I don't believe in cancel culture. I think we should cancel culture altogether. I like the idea that my friend Nick Cannon coined this phrase, council culture. And again, this is, Jews united for democracy and justice. In the Jewish faith, we have this concept of tshuva, right? Repentance. And so I believe, and at ADL, this is a discipline we learned long ago. When people make a mistake, you give them an opportunity to correct. And when they do that, if it is sincere, you welcome that apology. And so yesterday on The View, when she said, I'm sorry, I got this wrong, and then she gave me the opportunity to share that platform, I felt like that was very sincere, and I appreciated that opportunity. Now, I cannot speak to ABC News's internal processes. I haven't talked to anyone over there to understand why they did what they did, but these 2 weeks, I will say this, Madeleine. Number one, there's an opportunity for her to engage in a kind of introspection and learning, whether that means going to visit a museum like Skirball or the Museum of Jewish History here in New York or the Holocaust Museum in DC. And there's an opportunity to read, whether she chooses to read books like Elie Wiesel and some of the masterpieces that came out of the Shoah, or she chooses to read, more modern things like, I would point out David Baddiel's book is really good, Jews Don't Count. Dara Horn's book is wonderful. People love Dead Jews. My book isn't half bad. I mean, there are a bunch of things I think she can read that would, enrich her, educate her. But thirdly, The View can think about this as well. So The View can decide how they program the show over the next 2 weeks, who they bring on, what issues they discuss. And what I said on the program yesterday, which I'll say again here today, because I'm sure there are people from the industry watching, they are now in the search, conducting the search, Madeleine, to find a new host. I hope they'll consider a Jewish host for that show. There are some amazing people from the Jewish community who could deliver on this ethos of representation that's very important to that program and bring a Jewish point of view to talk about these issues in the way that Ana Navarro or, Whoopi herself or Joy Behar and the other women are able to do. So I think that would be a really nice way to turn this negative into a positive. And so I'm optimistic. And by the way, just so you know, I put in Janice's name.
Janice, are you looking for a job?
Don't tell, but I put in her name. So,
but stepping back from this, you mentioned a whole slate of anti-Semitic incidents.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this happening now? Why are we in this moment right now? It does seem to be heightened, and then statistics do bear this out. There have been an incredible increases in hate crimes, not just against Jews, but against all sorts of minorities.
Sure.
So you could focus on the Jews for a moment because there's something separate there in terms of history and symbolism and all that. But also, if you could broaden it out to others, why are we in this moment?
Well, that's a really important question. And we definitely are in a moment. So, the FBI has been tracking hate crimes since I think the early 90s. And in the most recent statistics that they issued late last year for 2020, the number was up 12%, with increases in nearly every category. So empirically speaking, according to law enforcement, hate crimes are up across the board. And the ADL has been counting anti-Semitic incidents since the 1970s, so longer than the FBI. We track not only acts of, say, vandalism and violence, which are misdemeanors and felonies, we also track acts of harassment, which might not rise to the level of a crime, but your elderly mom getting yelled at on a bus, or a Jewish kid, as happened in New York a couple weeks ago, an 8-year-old getting spat at by an adult who told him Hitler should have killed all of you. Or your child being bullied at the playground at school and pennies thrown at him or her. We track that through our network of 25 offices across the country, including right there in Los Angeles on Santa Monica Boulevard in Thayer. And I believe Jeffrey Abrams, the really talented director of that office, is somewhere on the line. We do really good work in LA. And David Lehrer, as was mentioned, was our longtime regional director there in LA, and really just a huge force in the community. And I can tell you about our data. Indeed, we have more than double the number of incidents today than we did 5 years ago. Literally, in 2020, we had more than 2,000 incidents, 2024, versus 941 in 2015. Think about that growth. Now, we were actually on a 15-year decline until 2016 when things spiked, and it was all tied to the presidential campaign. That's when it happened, which brings me to, well, why are we here? Number one, there's no question that we've had political figures who have created this space for the kind of invective and the kind of fear-mongering that we had just never seen before in presidential politics. Now, Madeleine, I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a liberal. I care less about how you vote and more about what you value. But we saw this with candidate Trump and then president-elect and then President Trump. Like, there's just no question. He said things, he did things that ushered in the extremists. Now, by the way, I'll also say that we have folks on the left, too, with ideas that I think are very intemperate and problematic. We can talk about that. But we never had a president with his hands on the lectern, literally in the White House briefing room, belittling and demeaning his opponents and the broader parts of the community in ways that this president did. So that gave a kind of license to people to express feelings that they might have had and suppressed or they just wouldn't have done before. That's number one. Number two, extremists exploited the opportunity and they moved from the margins, Madeleine, right into the mainstream. And look, when the Trump campaign credentialed white supremacists like members of the white supremacist press corps, there is such a thing, for their campaign events, they were all over it. And so we've seen them now literally try to move from the fringe right into the forefront. And now we have Proud Boys and Oath Keepers running for local office. I mean, it's really a problem. But the third thing that's contributed to it, I would suggest, has been social media. Mm-hmm. Social media is a super spreader of anti-Semitism and hate. I mean, there's just no question. Whereas previously, the LA Times or KCRW, you wouldn't allow white supremacists, on your programs. It's not like left, right, center, and the National Socialists. Like, there's a reason why you guys don't do that. And I deeply respect that. But on Facebook, their algorithms are engineered to amplify what's sort of toxic and what drives clicks. So that's what they've done. We can talk about why. But if social media has been an accelerant on anti-Semitism in ways we've never seen before. So I think all of those things contribute. And so now you have elected officials and public figures weaponizing anti-Semitism. You have the normalization of extremism, and social media's ubiquity has created complexity for all of us.
Can you backtrack just a little bit and focus a little bit on why so many anti-Semitic incidents?
Specifically against the Jews. Yeah, sure.
Right, because as we saw with Whoopi Goldberg, that's a question of just basic history, getting the facts wrong, right? You would think that by now we would, as a culture, understand the basics of this unique historical event, but sadly we do not. That says probably a lot to do with our state of our education system at this point. But anyway, aside from that, why Jews in particular?
Look, I think Jews, despite our numbers, we're less than 2% of the population, yet we attract an inordinate amount of attention. First from the haters. We're nearly 60% of the religiously motivated hate crimes in this country, despite the fact that, again, out of a nation of 335 million people, there's arguably between 6 to 7 million Jewish people, counting all levels of observance, cultural Jews, and all of that. I think the receding memory of the Holocaust has something to do with the moment that we're in. The Holocaust remains a potent force, like a symbol of the depravity of man. That racialized anti-Semitism that culminated in this annihilation of European Jewry is held up, as the example of all evil. And in light of the fact that so much time has passed, in light of the fact that extremists have been distorting and denying the Holocausts for decades, and there are less survivors to talk about it, and in an age in which there seem to be no more absolute truths, it's become a product, increasingly productized, if you will, in our political environment. Yeah. So whether it's comparing COVID-19 like masking guidelines to the Nuremberg race laws, or people putting on Jewish stars to claim that they are somehow being deprived, or people describing Israel as committing genocide against the Palestinian people, or other just outrageous claims. I think part of the reason why we've seen this increase in anti-Semitism is the Holocaust recedes and the shame around it starts to fade a bit. The Holocaust has become a potent political weapon for both extremes on both sides. I think that has something to do with it. And then again, I think the reality is, as we try to make sense of this, anti-Semitism has always been there, Madeleine. It's like this virus that lurks under the surface. And unfortunately, when you like lift the lid up, it comes out like that. And part of what's also challenging, I think, Madeleine, is that, its primacy and persistence throughout the history of Western civilization puts us to today where it's known that anti-Semitism is wrong, but so again, people wheel it out. And it's not like some forms of prejudice that you see on one side or the other. Both sides weaponize anti-Semitism for their own purposes. With Donald Trump making claims about the people who don't support his Israel policy, quote, don't love Israel, like the Jews don't love Israel who don't align with him, which goes right to the dual loyalty trope, right? Or then, again, people on the left saying, well, considering their history, Jews shouldn't be committing, genocide against Palestinians, when clearly there's nothing like that happening. Despite the very tough policies in Israel and their relations with the Palestinians, there's no genocide happening there. So I think these things create a kind of dichotomy and a very incongruous for people as they try to make sense of this moment.
The Trump case is a little bit complicated in that his daughter and son-in-law are both Jewish. And so I'm wondering how that played with the far right in that contingent.
Well,
and he's talking outside on the other side of his mouth, saying, good people on both sides.
I can tell you, the ADL, our center, as David well knows and Jeff Abrams well knows, our Center on Extremism, Madeleine, has been following these extremist groups for decades and decades. So our analysts and our investigators, we have a really talented woman, Joanna Mendelson, who runs the West Coast division out of the LA office. We're tracking these people and working with law enforcement to try to identify the threats and help address them. And we would read in the extremist outlets, whether it's subreddits or what was known as 4chan and 8chan and Discord and Gab and these other platforms, they despised Jared. They despised Ivanka. They held them in the lowest regard, let alone other people like Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin. They were constantly being pilloried in this white supremacist media. So, you're right to point out, look, President Trump, literally, with Jewish grandchildren in the residence, there had never been someone occupying the Oval Office who had such a personal relationship with the Jewish people. And yet, again, it's undeniable that he brought Steve Bannon into the White House, who may have been the biggest enemy of the Jewish people to ever, walk inside the West Wing. Because this was a man who openly, admired aspects of, fascist movements, who not only kind of, lifted up people like Viktor Orban and other folks who I would describe as very dangerous to our community. He was open about the fact that, his goal was to tear down the state. And let me be crystal clear here tonight, Madeleine. For all of its flaws, liberal democracy has been the best form of governance for the Jewish people over our 2,000 plus years in diaspora. There's no doubt in my mind that liberal democracy as a model and America as a nation has been the most welcoming, the most supportive, the place where we could thrive openly as Jews. In contrast to the way that my grandparents lived in Europe, where they were not able to, then ultimately, again, they were slaughtered. Or the way that my wife's family that grew up in Iran, where they were not able to show up as their full selves. Like, America was the place we could do that, which is why I think at a time when Jews are getting shot in kosher supermarkets, held hostage in synagogues, harassed on street corners, demonized on social media, and so on, and again, our very suffering questioned in prime time television, that's why Jews feel like, wait a second, what's going on here? It's very unmooring and leads to all of these questions.
Right. And by a supposed ally, no less. All right, let's get to the book. It Could Happen Here is the title. What is it?
Well, look, I was just alluding to this. I wrote the book in part based on, I dedicate it to my grandfather, who was a Jew from Germany, who, as a young man, never could have imagined the only country he ever knew after the rise of the Third Reich, it would turn on him, regard him as an enemy of the state, destroy everything that he loved, and slaughter almost his entire family and friends and force him to come here. When he was a young man, he never could have guessed he would have, a grandson in America, me. And my wife's family from Iran, Jewish family from Iran. When she was young, she never could have imagined. My father-in-law never would have guessed before the rise of the Islamic Republic that one day the only country they ever knew would turn on them, regard them as enemies of the state, destroy everything that they ever loved, and force them to flee for their lives to this country. My father-in-law never could imagine when he was young, he'd have grandchildren in America, my kids and my nieces and nephews. So what's it? It is knowing that I have no guarantee that my grandchildren will be born in this country. That whether it's civil unrest or sectarian violence, the thing that we so take for granted here, Madeleine, this democracy, this open society, could all unravel if we don't hold it together. Democracy is not preordained, by natural law. There are no forces of gravity that keep this going. It is men and women who do this every day. And it is not a spectator sport that we get to watch, from the cheap seats, right? Like at the top of the Coliseum, you can see way down there the football game, but you're far away from it. We all have to be on the field of democracy. We all have to be engaged. This is a participation sport. And so what's the it? The it is all of this unraveling, all of this, evaporating. And, I wrote this proposal, the idea for this book, this is something that was crystallizing in my mind as I was doing this job at ADL, living through Charlottesville, living through Pittsburgh, living through Poway, living through El Paso. I could go on. And then I had written the proposal. That was in 2020. And then the insurrection happened. And we watched these people with masks and zip ties and makeshift weapons literally overtake the U.S. Capitol. Literally. Like brutalize Capitol police officers. Then I was like, oh my God, it could happen here. It's happening here. And so that was really, the urgency of this for me was really underscored on January the 6th.
And so are you talking about a Holocaust? Are you talking about a genocide?
I would suggest, I don't want to be, overly dramatic here. And I think the Shoah was this singular evil in the annals of history. There has never quite been anything like that before. The transcontinental extermination of the Jewish people because of this racialized notion, by the way, right? That they needed to be exterminated because we were subhuman. And using all of the 20th century kind of mechanics of this sort of war machine to track down and murder these people. There's nothing ever, God willing, nothing like that should ever happen again. There certainly have been genocides since and terrible sectarian violence. But what could happen here is it could be sectarian violence that might not break down along the lines of Jew versus non-Jew. It might break down along the lines of right versus left. I interviewed Barbara Walter for the book, professor from Santa Clara State, who actually has a book out herself, How Civil Wars Start, which is a book I would recommend, by the way. And she talks about all of the key indicators for civil war. Like all those lights are flashing right here on the control panel of America. That could be what it looks like. And I got news for you. Like if it's right versus left, you know who gets caught in the crossfire? So I worry a great deal because I think hate is this corrosive force that erodes the foundations of a society. You know, as Deborah Lipstadt has written, it starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews. So this amplifying anti-Semitism, this growing animus toward Jews, whether you're demonizing the Jewish people or the Jewish state, it's like acid eating away at, I think, our common bonds. And I'm deeply worried that the unraveling will end up ensnaring Jews, and that could be cataclysmic for all of us.
So Jews as not just a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, but or the anti-Semitism, I should say, predicting a possible impending civil war or civil strife in some way, but directly, obviously, being attacked as well and caught up in this.
Make no mistake, whether you like, Trump or you don't like Trump, whether you like the left or you like the right, if there is civil strife, we will lose. When I say we will lose, I think our houses of worship, the supermarkets where we shop, I mean, the places where we play out as a people, I think could be very much like in the crosshairs, and I think that would be terribly frightening.
So after Tree of Life, a lot of synagogues bolstered their security or enacted security, took lessons in how to defend themselves. In fact, that was what saved the rabbi in Texas in that last incident.
Yeah.
Do you think the federal authorities are taking this seriously enough?
That's a good question. So I would say a couple things. So number one, our theory of the case at ADL, right, is the best way to stop hate is to halt it before it happens. It's why we're deeply invested in prevention, right, in the analytics that we do to identify extremists and try to stop something before it takes place. And we use a combination of human intelligence and sophisticated technology to do that work. It's also, by the way, Madeleine, we're deeply invested in education, because you can't arrest your way out of hate. You have to change hearts and minds. ADL is one of the largest providers in America of anti-bias, anti-hate content in schools. We reach millions of kids every year. That being said, I think we need safety through both what I'll say is security and solidarity. First, security. I have been incredibly impressed in my conversations with FBI Director Wray, with DHS Secretary Mayorkas, an LA guy, by the way, Ali Mayorkas, and others in the federal and in the White House, Homeland Advisor Sherwood Randlett. They really get this. And the FBI and law enforcement have always been very good, in my experience, in dealing with, hate crimes and extremist groups, for sure. And if you saw Director Wray's testimony, maybe it's like 6 months ago, he said before Congress that domestic violent extremism is the single most significant threat to the homeland. Not that, violent Islamists aren't a problem, they are. Not that there are other groups that could be a problem, they are. But if you look at, the extremist-related murders over the last decade, there have been about 429, I think is the number. Memory serves me. One of those murders was, by the way, in 2020, was committed by somebody involved with Antifa. One. Of the remaining 429, 75+% were committed by right-wing extremists. People with discernible or concrete ties to white supremacist groups, armed militias, sovereign citizens, assimilationists, etc. So overwhelmingly, they are the threat. The FBI knows this. The FBI has all kinds of resources focused on this. And they indeed do training with synagogues. I will say that in collaboration with the ADL, as well as other great groups, like there's a group called the Secure Communities Network, there's a great group called the Community Security Service, the LA Federation works with LAPD. Here in New York, where I am tonight, there's a group called Community Security Initiative that does great work. So there are a lot of great NGOs in this space. And I got to tell you, when Rabbi Charlie came out of that hostage ordeal, in his first interview, he credited ADL and the training he got from our organization, which was very humbling. But with all of that said, there is more that could be done on the government side and the policy side. There's a DHS program called Nonprofit Security Grants. There's about $180 million that's allocated by the government to help fortify houses of worship and religious institutions. So a JCC, a synagogue, a mosque, a church. but there were more than $400 million worth of applications last year. So we want the government to double that money. But no matter how high you build your walls, Madeleine, no matter how you secure your network, no matter how many cameras you fasten in front or around the physical plant, the rabbi will always let the stranger in for a cup of tea. So I think we need to acknowledge that, yes, we need safety through security, and law enforcement is a big part of that equation, but we also need safety through solidarity. Where, again, Jews are less than 2% of the population. We need to find ways to educate and engage our allies in the Christian community in particular, as well as in the Muslim community, in the Hindu community, in the Sikh community, in the Baha'i community, and all the other faith groups and non-faith groups that are out there.
Well, maybe rabbis will not offer a stranger a cup of tea now, which is a very sad commentary.
No. I think they will, and they need to be able to do that. That is our tradition. That is our faith. Our faith is not one that you can engage right alone in your room. You need a minion to have the right sort of service. Our synagogues have always been, despite the security guards, despite the precautions, they will still open the door for the stranger. That's what the Torah commands us to do. And I don't think that should stop, but a mix of prevention, education, and then safety, as I said it, I think is the right way to do this.
You're talking about Barbara Walter, who wrote the book this on impending civil war, where she says the ingredients could be there for one. She's not saying it is actually impending. I want to get that straight.
For sure.
There are a lot of guardrails that, or there are a lot of other scenarios, I should say. But you also said you had a conversation with her about that she has a B plan. She has another place to go. And if somebody who is studying this has another place to go, what does that say to you?
Well, it's funny, there's this phrase, Madeleine, you may have heard it before, that I heard once. Let me see if I can get it right. It was during the Shoah, the pessimists were in New York and the optimists were in Auschwitz. It's pretty grim.
Yeah.
But I think here's the reality. America is the world's plan B. This is the place that the poor and huddled masses come to and where they seek refuge from despotic regimes, from sort of economic deprivation, right? From persecution, from suffering. This is plan B for humanity. So we have got to get this right. I don't think you can imagine that if you sneak off to New Zealand, you'll be okay. Are you kidding me? I mean, as America goes, so goes the world. And while I do believe, if you read the tea leaves, there's a lot of conversation these days about, is China the model for the 21st century? And there's a lot that many people admire about the Chinese model. Or, should we go somewhere else? And look, I say this as an ardent Zionist, an ardent and unapologetic Zionist, which we can talk about if you want. But make no mistake, I believe in American exceptionalism. I think this has been the greatest democracy in the history of the human race. I believe this country has achieved things beyond the imagination of our forebears. And I think we still have great days ahead of us. But again, not if you think America's going to work on cruise control. We don't get to draft off the greatest generation. We need to build not just physical infrastructure, the likes of which President Biden and others are talking about. We need to build civic infrastructure. We need to reanimate this democracy. And it is not going to be easy. I would have hoped out of COVID-19 we would come out in a different place. But this is why I think we need to talk now about what are the whole of society strategies to get this right. And because it's not going to happen on its own.
Yeah. So it's more than just showing up to vote every 2 to 4 years in the federal elections.
Yeah. I mean, what someone once told me that the only things you have to do in America as a citizen, the only things you have to do, serve on a jury, pay your taxes. That's it. legally. Those are your only obligations as a citizen. And I
Some
think
of us don't do that either.
Yeah, I was going to say. And
Yeah.
I think you have to pay taxes if you're not a citizen. But I got to say, like, that is the barest of minimums. And it's not about what's legally required of you. It's about what's ethically, what's morally required of you. Like, you know, this is why I'm not a fan of libertarianism at all. Like, we enjoy the fruits of this democracy. We enjoy the benefits of the community, the beloved community that's been built, and we need to continue building it. And again, it won't just happen on its own. We all have to be invested in our common present, let alone our shared future. And I say this because that means you got to volunteer. That means you got to just show up at your school board, run for the school board. That means you don't just like vote. Like you should, all of us should find ways to volunteer on the elections to make them work. That means that all of us should get engaged, again, in the mechanics of our democracy, whether it's at a local or state or federal level. Now, like, I had the privilege of serving in 2 White Houses. You know, I worked in the federal government in the Clinton administration and in the Obama administration. And I must say, these were extraordinarily privileges for me. But public service, whether you're a teacher, right, or, again, you work in the West Wing, like, all of us have a way that we can contribute and give back. Whether it's your full-time job or, again, you volunteer, like, all of us need to show up and we need to get involved.
All right, I'm going to ask a few questions from the viewers that David has been sending me. And yeah, there are quite a few of them. Lauren asks, can you explain the different definitions of racism on the ADL website?
Oh, it's a good question. So, you know, ADL runs all these education programs, and we had definitions on our website. You may have seen this before, I don't know. And one of the definitions that actually changed at some point in 2020 was a definition of racism. And I'll be frank, we had a definition up there that spoke specifically about racism, like in the context of systemic racism in America in the year 2020. And frankly, Madeleine, you know, it was inaccurate, or it was at least incomplete. We missed the mark. That definition of racism did not encompass the racism my own family has experienced as Jews from the Middle East. And so that was pointed out last week, maybe last Friday, right when we were heading into Shabbat. We've been a little distracted over the last few days, suffice to say, with some things going on. But if you go to the ADL website right now, we updated it. We changed it using a definition of racism developed by Professor Robert Livingston from Harvard University, who's a scholar and has done a lot of thinking and writing on this very subject. And I think one of the lessons from that process was realizing it changed, was we need to look at all of our content to make sure we're giving all eyes to it and reflecting all the views of our community. Like, ADL needs to remain firmly rooted in a principled place and not subject to the political whims of the moment. So whereas that previous definition was incomplete is insufficient for this organization. We've got to do better. I regret that it was up there. I'm glad we changed it. And now we're doing the after action to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Okay, Larry asked, did the ADL make a mistake in supporting Amnesty International despite its attitude towards Israel?
I don't know about ADL's support of Amnesty International, but I was pretty clear-eyed in what I said on Sunday about this new Amnesty International report, which I think is profoundly flawed and wrong. I don't think I pulled any punches. You can read what I wrote and what I said. This Amnesty International report, which delegitimizes the state of Israel in its very founding, I think is not just deeply flawed, it's downright dangerous. Again, as I was referencing before, Madeleine, we had Jews being attacked and assaulted in broad daylight, and the people attacking them, you know, weren't wearing MAGA hats. You know, they weren't like carrying Trump flags. Many of them had keffiyehs on. They came from anti-Israel events. And they were inflamed by this unhinged rhetoric that Israel is committing genocide. It is not. That Israel is an apartheid state. It is not. Now, I say this as a person who believes in a two-state solution, who thinks it's critical that the Palestinians can realize their national aspirations in a way that it provides them with the dignity and equality that they deserve. Just like that arrangement needs to ensure the safety and security of Israelis. I think this can and this must be done. But don't take it from me as an apartheid state. Talk to the Arab ministers in the Israeli government. Is there another coalition government in the Middle East, let alone in the world, that has that kind of diversity? We don't have it in this country. You don't have it in any other democracy, arguably in Western Europe. What the Israelis are doing, Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis, Russian Israelis and Ethiopian Israelis, Sephardim and Mizrahim and Ashkenazi, it should be the envy of the world. But when Amnesty releases a report like this, which isn't corrective, it's just demonizing, it helps no one. And it creates the conditions in which the anti-Semitism I talked about before is bound to spark up even worse. So I guess I would really ask, if I were here with the CEO of Amnesty International, I would say, what's your point? Is your point to join the legions of people and organizations who seek to delegitimize and demonize the Jewish state? Or is your point to create a better outcome for Palestinians and Israelis? I just think I prefer a solutions-oriented approach. I prefer looking forward. I prefer working on the hard stuff. It's easy to slam Israel. Get in line. It's harder to get the real stuff done. I wish they had chosen that approach.
And earlier you said you wanted to talk about the bias on the left, anti-Semitic comments on the left as well as on.
I don't know if I said that, but we can.
I think it was at the outset of our conversation. But I guess I'm wondering, how do you thread the needle, and how do you have a productive conversation about Israel and the Palestinians without being critical of their policies, without being labeled anti-Semitic?
Oh, this is a canard. This is a fiction. So do you want to know an organization that criticizes the Israeli government? I'll give you a URL to look up. You can all do this when you're done with this Zoom. Go to adl.org. Last week I was criticizing the government about settler violence. I don't think they're doing enough to stop it. This is a fiction and a lie that you can't criticize Israel about being called anti-Semitic. That's actually not true. You can criticize Israeli policies all day, just like you can criticize policies of the government in Beijing, or you can criticize policies of the government in Washington, D.C. What's different is when you delegitimize the country, and again, suggest that it is somehow illegal in its very founding. Keep in mind, the only Jewish state in the world, the place that was created as a haven in our ancestral homeland after we were butchered and slaughtered and ghettoized across Europe and the Middle East and other places, okay? So the idea that you delegitimize it, make it criminalize Zionism. Secondly, that you demonize it, like, using Nazi swastikas superimposed on the Israeli flag. That is revolting. I want you to imagine the opponents of Saudi Arabia desecrating the Saudi flag with symbols of, with the Crusader symbol. Imagine that for a moment. How would that sit with our Muslim brothers and sisters? Not very well. So I think we've got to realize that this intentional inversion depicting Israel as a Nazi regime is anti-Semitic at its core. And then thirdly, holding the country to double standards. I have no problem with Amnesty doing reports about Israel, but I would ask, are they giving equal time? Is there the same amount of energy devoted to countries where arguably the human rights practices are, I don't know, slightly worse? So here's a homework assignment for anyone who's interested, who's watching this Zoom tonight. Someone should please tell me how many reports Amnesty International has written over the last, 40 years about Israel, about the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a fascist totalitarian government. I don't know about Gaddafi's Syria, or Gaddafi's Libya, Assad's Syria. How about North Korea? So Madeleine, I say this in all honesty, I don't know the numbers. I'm gonna guess I know. So all I would suggest is,
but why do you think that is?
I think there are those, again, I think there's a kind of anti-Semitism at the core by those people who don't believe in Zionism and the Jewish right to self-determination. So whereas previously, Madeleine, for 1,000 years, you could say the Jewish people don't belong. The Jewish people are malevolent. The Jewish people are killing Gentile children. The Jewish people should go back. Go back to Palestine is what they said about the Jews before World War II. Today they say, I have no problem with the Jewish people. It's the Jewish state that doesn't belong. It's the Jewish state that is malevolent. It's the Jewish state that's killing, in this time, Palestinian children. It's the Jewish state. They should go back to Poland, they say now. Like, unfortunately, anti-Semitism is this virus, like we said before, and it has mutated and taken different shapes. So now it is anti-Zionism. But it is found, it is like, again, I will say this loud and clear. If you are a Palestinian family who was displaced in 1948, I don't expect you to march in the Israel Day Parade, for God's sakes. You have a legitimate claim to want your own state. If things had been different in 1948, if the UN partition had been agreed to by the Arab countries like it was by the Jewish government, by the Yishuv, then they'd be in a different place. But put that aside for a second. I get the fact that if you're a Kartai person, or a person of a particular sect of Judaism that thinks is waiting for Moshiach to come, God bless you. But those who espouse a kind of political anti-Zionism, those who espouse a kind of racial anti-Zionism, those who espouse a kind of hateful anti-Zionism, I mean, I would tell you that is anti-Semitism in the year 2022. There's no doubt about it. And the last thing I'll say, getting back to your first question to me about intention, it may very well be that some of the people who espouse anti-Zionism today do not do so because they realize it is anti-Semitism. They do it because they believe in the national aspirations of the Palestinian people. But whether that is their intention or not, the reality is the outcome can still be dangerous for Jewish people. What I mean by that is the kind of in-your-face brutality we saw last May. The kind of thing that happens when someone goes into a synagogue in Texas because the Jews control everything. So even if your intent, someone who espouses anti-Zionism, is not to be anti-Semitic, that doesn't mean it might not imperil Jews in real life. And that, in my mind, is a problem.
Okay, I think
maybe I should tell you how I really feel about it, huh?
Yeah, we could go down we have another hour on Israel, but we're at the end of this hour. So
can I say one last thing?
Yeah.
So I have been an outspoken, unapologetic critic of the Trump administration and others on these issues of anti-Asian hate. When the president was standing at the lectern talking about the Wuhan flu and the Chinese flu, knowing that Asian Americans were getting assaulted in our streets here, knowing that they were being harassed and attacked. Still, he said that. Still, others in elected office said that, fanning the flames of anti-Asian hate. Look, you can have very strong feelings about what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. You can have very strong feelings about Hong Kong democracy activists and how they're being treated, or the surveillance state in China. But that is no excuse to assault Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in this country. Full stop. And when that happens, we expect our elected officials, we expect public figures to say they are against anti-Asian hate, period. And so I would say you can have strong feelings about what's happening in the Middle East. But that is no excuse to harass and attack Jews in this country. And when it happens, public figures and elected officials should say they're against anti-Semitism, full stop, no qualifications.
Okay, just a few seconds left, but I just want you to end on
a positive note.
Well, not only a positive note, but on a note that can give us tools as to what we can do going forward if we are as alarmed as you are and others about what's happening to the country.
Okay. So number one, so a few things. So I do feel positive, Madeleine. This country has survived civil wars and global conflict and economic upheaval. And our democracy has always rebounded stronger on the other side. That we've never had, I think, a nation quite as resilient as this one. So I am optimistic. I know what America is capable of, and I know what the Jewish people are capable of. We have survived and thrived in the most difficult circumstances. We can continue to do that here. But what can you do? Well, literally, that's why I wrote the book. The book is like a handbook. I use all these I shared all these tactics and tips from ADL and how we confront hate. This is what I would say for all of you as individuals. Number one, when you see something, say something. Halt hate when it happens in your Facebook feed, at the dinner table, at the water cooler, on the Zoom meeting. You got to interrupt it and stand up against hate when it happens from someone on your own side. So I mean it. Like if you're a progressive, call out anti-Semitism when it comes from the left. If you're a conservative, call it when it comes from the right. Call it out unequivocally, without hesitation. Number one. Number two, again, like I said, cancel culture altogether. This is why I accepted Whoopi's apology. We need to give people the opportunity to repent and to do better. I mean, again, this is our tradition as Jews, and I think we need to remind ourselves of that. And then number three, getting back to your earlier, line of questioning, get involved. Like you need to be in it to win it. And democracy is, again, it needs you on the field. I'll make one final note. I beg of our legislators, I beg of our elected officials to do something about social media. This is, I think, the single biggest exogenous factor that's amplifying the anti-Semitism, that's fanning the fires of hate. If we could get social media under control, that would be a good thing for all of us.
All right. Well, thank you. That was an impassioned and fascinating discussion. So thank you for being with us.
Can I thank Janice and Mel and Zev and David and everyone for hosting me, and you for your terrific questions and just making this interesting and fun for both of us. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for tuning in. Next week, we are going to be talking about all the challenges colleges are facing. Warren Olney will be your host. So stay tuned for that. And until then, be good, be active, be engaged, and stay healthy first and foremost. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.